What a pleasure to be here with you all in what the Americans call my hometown, where I grew up. Obviously, a place very close to my heart, where my family still is, and where I learnt a lot about who I wanted to be. So when Sam asked me to come and talk with you all here, I was excited to share a bit about how did I build Zola, which is today one of the fastest growing e-commerce startups in the US. But first of all, wanted to share my journey of how I got there, because I think the story of how I learned to be an entrepreneur and found Zola is almost more exciting than the process of growing Zola over the last 4 years. So let's seem to start at the last slide. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay. So I left Sydney in 2004 to do an MBA at Stanford Business School. And the reason that I wanted to do that was I had always dreamt of starting something, having a big impact. And at that time, which was in the 90s, was reading, or in the 2000s, I should say, was reading a lot about the great companies being built, having an impact on the world, which were companies like eBay, Amazon, Yahoo. Seems like a long time ago now. And it seemed like all those companies were started in Silicon Valley. A lot of them were associated with Stanford. And I thought, well, if I want to be like those companies, I probably need to get there. What is so exciting for me to see now here today is that for many of you who are probably feeling the same way I was feeling 10 years ago, excited, passionate to start something, wanting to get started, the good news is you don't need to travel around the world, spend $100,000 on a business school degree and leave home. You can do it right here because the ecosystem here is so different to when it was when I left. So when I got to Stanford, I started thinking, how do I learn to build these companies that I really admire, companies like Yahoo? And I thought I should probably work in one of those to learn how they built it from zero to be one of the world-changing companies. So I interviewed at the internet companies in Silicon Valley and found that the people I really admired most, that I thought were very smart, that I could learn a lot from, all happened to work at Yahoo at the time. So took a job there, worked there after business school for 2 years, got to work on what they call product marketing, which is really thinking about new products to bring to market and thinking about what do customers need that aren't currently in the market, and how can we create those online products for that audience. After 2 years, I started to realize all the smart people that I admired greatly were starting to leave Yahoo and go to other startups like Facebook, which was kind of emerging at that time. And I thought, well, that's a bad sign. If all the smartest people are leaving, I should probably start to think about leaving too. So went to interview at smaller startups, which were fast growing, and wanted to move from, at that time, Yahoo was a 10,000 person company to maybe a few hundred person company. So was interviewing around Silicon Valley and just happened to also be shopping on this site that had just launched at the time. It was called Gilt Group. Hands up if you've heard of Gilt Group before. Okay, so a bunch of people. So for those of you who don't know, it started as a flash sale e-commerce shopping site where the idea was you could get great designer brands at 80% off retail price for 24 to 48 hours. So started in 2008, became very successful very quickly. And that was also the year I happened to be looking for the next exciting opportunity, was shopping every day on this site, was obsessed with this site. And I thought, well, if I'm looking at it every day, maybe I should just work there, because what would be better than to be paid to spend time on something I already spent time on. Found that the people who worked there were all incredibly smart with their own impressive backgrounds. And the more I spoke to friends, the more friends would say, oh, I spend all my money on that site. So that seemed like a good time. Joined Gilt when it was about 30 people, and it had just been focusing on women's fashion. And because that was the time that it was just starting to pick up steam, was really lucky to be able to have a seat on what turned out to be a great rocket ship over the next 4 years. So over the 4 years that I was at Gilt, it grew from 30 people to over 1,000 people, and it grew from 7 million in revenue to over 500 million in revenue. So it was a fast growth experience, and I learned a great deal there. I got to be the product lead on redefining what do we want the Gilt experience to be for both women's fashion, but I also got to be the product lead on all the new business launches, which included expansion into men's, home, kids. I got to launch all the mobile products and then run the mobile product portfolio as the business lead. And then I had the experience of being able to pitch and launch my own idea for a business within Gilt, which was a food and wine business, and we called it Gilt Taste. And that was the best experience I could ever have to start something myself eventually, because I learned a lot about how to launch a mini startup within the safety net of a bigger startup. So over that time, I got to really transition from a pure product development, product management role into more of a general management role and learn a bit about what it might be like to be a startup CEO. Got to run functions like merchandising, marketing, business development, things that I had not been exposed to before. And eventually also learned a lot of lessons the hard way on what ultimately I think did not work about Gilt, which then led it to go from, at one point, a valuation over $1 billion to be sold, I think a few years ago, for between 200 to 300 million. So a lot of learnings there, which then informs what we think about when we started Zola. So after 4 years at Gilt, I thought, that was fun, I want to do it all over again, and joined another startup in New York called Chloe and Isabel. It was around the same size as Gilt was when I started, about 30 people. It is a direct-to-consumer jewelry startup that is trying to grow via the direct selling business model. And what I learned there was I was essentially doing the same role that I had been doing at Gilt for the last 4 years, and I kind of thought to myself, why am I doing the same thing over again? I've always wanted to start something. Why don't I just do it? And at that point, had no more excuses, had met up with my friend and partner who I'd worked with for a long time at Gilt. His name is Nobu. We had always talked about starting something, and we looked at each other and we said, why don't we just do it? So we quit our jobs the next day and started brainstorming. And the brainstorming process was, as if any of you have gone through it, you might find it an easy one. We found it a particularly painful process. It really involved thinking about what are all the products and services that we have used that we haven't loved, and what do we think we could spend the next 7 to 10 years of our lives at least focused on as our startup idea. That year that we were brainstorming was 2013, also happened to be the year that all my friends got married at exactly the same time, and was going to a lot of weddings and having to buy a lot of wedding presents. And in the US, a very common practice is that when you go to a wedding and buy a present, you have to buy it from a wedding registry. Everyone who gets married has to essentially set up a registry, and then you share it with your friends, and they buy you gifts from that registry. So what we have here on the left is kind of the process of what people have been going through for, since the 1920s, walking through department stores, registering for things, not quite sure what you need, what you want, but kind of being forced to go through this routine every time. On the right-hand side, you have what a registry looks like before Zola started. This is from a department store in the US called Bloomingdale's, and it was ugly. It was buying gifts from my friends' registries in 2013 was one of the worst e-commerce shopping experiences I had ever had. And, and so we started to talk to more and more brides going through the process, just to learn more about, was there something to this idea? And we heard the same comments come up again and again from these customers, which were, they hated registering, which was crazy because here you have the one opportunity to tell all your friends exactly what they should buy you, and yet people were complaining about this as the worst part of the wedding planning experience. And the same three themes kept coming up again and again as we spoke to brides, which were, one, they hated having to register at 3 different places to get all the things that they wanted. Typically, they would register at one department store for kitchen equipment, and one place because they wanted cash and they wanted to set up a honeymoon fund, and then another place to get bedding and bathware. And so we thought, there's no reason why anyone wants to do the same thing 3 times over. It should all just be in the one place. And so that was one of the main things we thought, what about having a registry where you can register for products and experiences and cash all in the one place? Another thing that we heard was that couples today spend so much planning their weddings. So in the US, on average, people spend $30,000, and that's the average across the country. In New York, the average is $70,000 on one day. And so brides care about making their wedding day beautiful, and that extends to their wedding registry. They want to make it look as beautiful as the rest of their wedding. And yet, every other registry was ugly. It was not personalized in any way, and we found that brides really wanted to tell their story. They wanted to explain why they were asking for certain gifts, and so with Zola, we thought, you should be able to do that. And then the third thing that we heard, which was a big surprise, and it only came out from actually talking to brides going through the process. The third thing we heard was that when people registered at other department stores, and when guests bought them the gifts would just start showing up, and you had no idea what was coming, who sent it, if you even wanted to keep it. Often you'd be away on your wedding or in your honeymoon, and things would start showing up, and people were so stressed out because they had no control. So what turned into what should be a happy occasion, having a gift arrive, turned out to be a really stressful occasion. So we thought, that's very easily solved using design and technology. What about if the couple could just control when they decide to receive their gifts? And that's how we came to landing on the idea for Zola. We debated a number of other different ideas. In fact, we debated hundreds of ideas. We actually had a short list of 3 ideas. I'll tell you the other 2 in case anyone wants to do them. One is we had an idea for an education app that lets teachers communicate with teachers communicate with parents about the grades of their students. And we did also a lot of interviews with people in the industry, so friends that we'd known that worked in education. And the reason we didn't end up doing that one, even though it felt like it would have a huge impact if we could solve this, was because the more we spoke to people in the industry, the more we realized we weren't personally passionate about this problem. And after a week of talking to people, Nobu, my co-founder, and I looked at each other, and we both asked each other, are you still excited about this? And we were both like, oh. And so we realized, we weren't excited after 2 weeks. It would be hard to probably stay excited about that one problem for the next 7 to 10 years. So that was one. There was another idea that we had around our love for food and snacks. That was a snack box delivery idea. And the reason we didn't do that was learning from our Gilt taste experience. We just kept coming back to there's some fundamental business model challenges around delivering food and shipping food that we didn't feel like we were the best position to solve. When it came to Zola as an idea, thinking about how can we create the best possible wedding registry, we felt like we had the experience in design because Nobu ran the user experience design team at Gilt. His designs have won many awards and many millions of users over. And because I had the background in e-commerce, in building products that I knew customers love, and then the background in managing e-commerce platforms on the back end, we knew together we could really nail this particular idea. And so we launched, and we thought about, we know these three differentiators: the ability to register for products, experiences, and cash, the ability to personalize, and the ability to control shipping would mean that our user experience on the front end was better than any other registry in the US out there. What was the tricky part was now thinking about how do we develop a business model that means that this can be a sustainable, profitable, big business. And the market, I should say, is actually a huge market. So in the US, wedding registries alone account for $19 billion a year. And so we knew that if we could even capture 5%, that's already a $1 billion a year business. The tricky thing is we learned from Gilt, we were not interested in being in an inventory business ever again. i.e., we did not want to buy inventory. We know that managing a business where you are required to buy inventory is hard. We realize that VCs are never excited about investing in inventory businesses, and that it just adds costs to the company that are going to be eternally hard to ever cover as a business and become profitable. And so in thinking about how do we solve that problem, we remember that at Gilt Taste, which was the food business I ran at Gilt, we had a dropship model, which was essentially that we worked with vendors to ship products directly from their warehouses to the end customer, which meant that we didn't have to buy inventory, but we could still control the transaction and make sure that the customer got the product based on when they wanted to receive it. And so we set out to then try and get as many brands or vendors as possible to onboard them onto the Zola registry store or platform so that couples would have those products available to add to their registry. And I can tell you a fun story about how we did that. In the early days, like any startup, it comes down to doing things that do not scale. And so to get the first vendors on board or the first brands on board, it was a lot of going to people that I had worked with before at Gilt, pitching them the Zola pitch deck that we showed to investors, and walking them through the product to convince them that this was the registry of the future and they should take a bet on us and work with us early. And it was through that one-on-one pitching with many vendors that we were able to launch with 100 vendors at launch, and over time, now I think we're up to 500 vendors. We have over 50,000 products because we show that we're able to bring brands a new audience that they are struggling to capture, because department stores are dying. Three and a half years after we've launched Zola, we started working on Zola exactly 4 years ago to this week. That's when we came up with the idea. We started raising a small seed round from one angel investor, Kevin Ryan, who we worked with at Gilt. And then we got busy hiring our first 2 engineers, designing the product, talking to couples, and getting to launch. We launched within about 5 months, and so now we have been live for over 3.5 years. We're now the fastest growing wedding registry in the US. I mentioned we're one of the fastest growing e-commerce sites in the US and have raised over 40 million in VC funding. Most recently did a Series C late last year at a 200 million pre-money valuation, which means we're one of the most valuable weddings companies in the world. And all because it turns out couples getting married today are different than couples getting married in previous generations, which I'm sure should be no surprise to most of you here, but it turns out that it's a surprise to many of the more traditional retail businesses. Couples getting married today, they do prioritize experiences over just products. They do tend to be getting married at an older age than ever before. So on average, couples get married between 29 to 31, whereas just a generation ago, the average age of marriage was 22, so big difference. And on average, most couples tend to live together before they get married. So the whole idea of what it means to get married has not been addressed before we launched. And I think this is interesting. I speak to hundreds of founders every year at different events, and the thing that always surprises me is how the most successful companies that I've come across have been ones that are serving very traditional industries, kind of like the weddings industry, but thinking about it in a new way for a new generation. So this, I wanted to show you what an example Zola registry looks like. Hopefully, if you have seen someone else's registry, you will find that ours looks significantly different. But we have found product market fit, and the way we know that is because we see it through the couples coming to us to use Zola as their registry. They find out about us because their friends told them about us. And that source of virality is somewhat inbuilt into the product, in that when you get married, on average, you invite 150 people to your wedding. And so we have 150 people seeing Zola for every couple that chooses to register with us. But it also is from the fact that if you have a great product, people will want to talk about it to others. And so that has been the secret to our success, is really focusing on really getting the product right for this particular audience. And once we found that, because we had a business model that worked, because we didn't require the business take inventory, we've been able to be one of the more successful e-commerce businesses in the US, because we've learned a lot of lessons of what did not work from our previous time at Gilt. So with that, I am happy to take any questions. I think Sam has some questions prepared.
Thank you very much. Everybody give a round of applause to Shan, and take a seat. Do you want to take a seat?
Yeah.
And we'll head into questions. So we're running a little behind, so we'll keep this as brief as we can so we can get back to schedule. So I want to start with maybe the Gilt era. And Kevin Ryan, maybe this audience doesn't realize, he's kind of a big deal, right? Like, he started 3, I think, 100 million plus companies, Gilt being one of them. I guess, how did you come to kind of join Gilt in the first place and get to know Kevin, and what did he teach you, I guess, during that period you were there?
Yeah, for those of you who aren't familiar with Kevin Ryan, he has been called the godfather of New York tech, and he is a serial entrepreneur. So he was the original founder and chairman of Gilt Group, and then he also founded Business Insider as well as MongoDB, and is a co-founder and investor in Zola. And so the way that I came across Gilt was, I mentioned I was a customer, and I then went to their jobs board. I found the perfect job that I was looking for. I threw my resume in through the website, got a call the next day, started interviewing, and I think one of the key reasons I actually got the job, I was in Silicon Valley at the time, but I just said, once it was clear that I was in the interviewing process, I said, I will fly myself to New York. I will meet whenever you want me to interview with the rest of the team. I really want this job. And I think that hustle of being willing to just fly myself there to get in front of the right people meant that I was able to, I think, get ahead of most of other candidates. And that's how I got the job.
Cool. And then, and so obviously you mentioned the hypergrowth years of Gilt. You joined when there was 7 million revenue, around 30 employees, and you left at 500 mil and 1,000 employees. What are the downsides to that kind of growth? And maybe talk a little bit about your experience with Gilt Taste.
Yeah. So so I mentioned a bit about the inventory business model. And so one of the downsides of having an inventory business model is not just the cost of buying the inventory and then having to get rid of it. It's the cost of all the people associated with managing that inventory. So the Gilt business model specifically was the flash sale model, where you have new products every day, and it's exciting for the users. As customers, we love it because we love seeing new things. But from the business model perspective, it made it extremely capital intensive, because apart from the inventory, you have to hire a huge merchandising team to go and source new products every day. You have to have a huge warehouse, which is very expensive, all the people to work in the warehouse, the huge customer support team to support the cost of doing the inventory, and then the creative team to photograph, write about, and manage all that inventory coming in and out every day. And so that's why we needed 1,000 people in that business. And that's why at Zola we thought, how can we have a business that actually doesn't require that many people, because that is extremely expensive from the people perspective.
Yeah.
So that was a big learning. And so at Zola, we've been able to scale. We have 65 people today, and I think we are extremely scalable as a business.
Yeah, awesome. And so related to that, I guess, is, we live in an era where I think a lot of people feel that a lot of e-commerce will pretty much be dominated by Amazon, and maybe they'll be a benevolent monopolist, but that is the reality. Do you think, what's your advice, I guess, to other e-commerce founders who are kind of coming up against that question when they're pitching investors? What do they have to compete in this landscape?
I love the Amazon question because it lets me talk about how I think we win in the market against players like that, Amazon. So there's 3 ways. One is focus, because we are a wedding registry company. That's the only thing we do all day, every day. We think about it 24/7. There is great value in focus. And similarly, customers, when they think about wedding registry, they think about us. The second way we win is in the user experience, design. So everything that we've designed in the product is focused on how can we build the best possible wedding registry experience. We're not trying to solve for 50 different use cases. So the example I like to give, I have a registry that I've set up on Amazon just to see what they're doing. And because I also buy my dog food from Amazon, they're constantly recommending that I should add dog food to my wedding registry. Another friend, someone else on my team, buys a lot of batteries from Amazon, so they get a lot of recommendations to register for batteries. So that's just one example of how we're designing in a way that is just focused on this single user and use case. And then the third I mentioned, I hinted to before, is the power of the brand and wanting the user to project their own brand through the brands that they use for their wedding. So if you're spending $30,000 to $70,000 on one day, you want it to be beautiful, you want it to represent what you love, and you're not going to pick a brand for your wedding registry that is going to compromise the rest of what you're spending on the rest of the day. And so because we've built a brand that we believe is beautiful, that is highlighting our users and what they love, we think that there is emotion and value from what they get from using our brand on their wedding.
And so, you're a startup, right? You're still acquiring you're into the thousands now, but your first users, and you're penetrating more and more cities all the time. And people think wedding registries, and they're thinking Nordstrom's or any of those 3 categories you talked about. So how are you going about kind of getting into these couples and their lives at that point when they're thinking about this?
So we have our organic strategy and then the paid marketing strategy. So on the organic front, I mentioned every couple that uses Zola is essentially sharing Zola with 150 of their closest friends and family, and that's been the biggest source of our growth to date. The other thing that we found really works for us on the organic side is we focused on couples where we see evidence of early product market fit. So in the early days, in the first 6 months of launch, I really studied the couples that had been using Zola and was trying to identify what is common amongst these couples so that we can go out and find more of those couples. And what I realized was that we actually had a great number of couples coming from, they were getting married and their families were coming from two different traditions, religions, backgrounds. So for example, you might have a couple coming from either an Indian or a Chinese or a Jewish family where they prioritize getting cash for their wedding. And then the other half of the couple is coming from a family that really prioritizes getting products as wedding gifts. And it's very important to that family that you have a table setting as part of your wedding registry. And for those couples, Zola was the perfect solution because you could have all of that in one registry and in a beautiful place where you can explain why you have all of these things to each other's families. So we found actually it was interesting, it just happened that this was the couple we were attracting, and we started doing more marketing around it. We started to feature these kinds of diverse couples in our marketing, and it just accelerated. And so that, now having looked into the data, it turns out that 40% of couples getting married in the US come from two diverse backgrounds. So it's another emerging trend that we're addressing. Similarly, same-sex marriage laws have passed pretty recently in the US. We are one of the few registries that actually supports and showcases that kind of marriage. And so again, that word of mouth has really spread in that community for Zola. On the paid side, there is nothing we won't test. And the nice thing about when people get married is the day they get married, they switch their Facebook status to engaged, and they post photos of their engagement everywhere. And so you can really actually clearly target those who are in that audience who have just gotten engaged and who are really then starting to research everything for their big day.
Yeah. Awesome. So just going really deep on who these people are and why they might be different and how to target them. Fantastic. So I might go to audience Q&A. So great first question. You've done both an MBA and started a startup and worked at startups. Talk about the benefits of doing an MBA versus a startup, and would you do it again?
Mm-hmm. I would personally, and I think it all depends on the individual and where they're at in their life. The reason I loved it is I was exposed to hundreds of people like me in my class who all wanted to do very similar things and who were just going off to do them. And I found that very inspiring to say, here's someone with a pretty similar background who aspires to do the same thing, and they're already off to the races. It made doing a startup feel very doable, as well as getting exposed to the best professors and entrepreneurs who would talk about what they learned, particularly about what went wrong and what they learned from it. I think that really opened my eyes to all the different types of startup journeys that were available. And as much as I hate to admit this, it is actually pretty useful to know accounting, finance, modeling, data and decision-making based modeling. That has all come in useful every single day of this startup.
Yep, cool. What advice do you have for young girls wanting to run a business in the future? So maybe think about some of the high school students here in the audience. What would your advice be to them?
I think for anyone, particularly young girls, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do whatever you want to do. And if you want to start something, if you want to start or run a business, think about what is the most exciting business that you could possibly think of, and then just go do it and get to know people who are already doing it. Think about what you need to do to run it, what are the skills that you need, and then just go and do it.
Awesome. So we have a question about sort of explaining in a bit more detail how Zola makes money. So, are you a marketplace that just takes a slice, or do you charge a software fee for kind of hosting the registry during a period, or are you a retailer, taking retail-like margins? Maybe kind of go a bit deeper into that.
Yeah. Our business model is essentially an e-commerce business model. So we work with the brands that you see within the Zola store, and we will work with them like any other retailer does, in that they typically sell things to a retailer for a wholesale price. We sell it to the customer for the retail price. We keep the margin in between, like any other retailer or e-commerce site does. So in that sense, it's a very straightforward e-commerce business. The only difference between us and an e-commerce business is there's two things. One is, I mentioned, we don't take inventory for the most part. We are all drop ship. And then the second piece is we are able to have very low returns. So returns is another silent killer of any e-commerce business, because it's great if you're growing and you're selling things, but then you think you've sold something and 30 days later it comes back and then you have to resell it again, potentially at a lower price. That adds a huge amount of cost to your business that you never expect it will. The way that we have solved returns is through the feature that I mentioned, where the customer can control when items are shipped to them. So because you get to define when you want your item shipped to you, for the most part, you have the opportunity to change your mind if you're going to change your mind. And so because couples will look at what they've been given as gifts and think about, what do I really want to keep, and what do I want to exchange into Zola credit and then use for something else, the virtual return, as we call it, has happened without us ever having to send anything out. And for that reason, we have had extremely low returns and have just delivered a much better customer experience, because the customer doesn't have to receive all these things they don't want, lug it back to the store, and wait there while they get the thing they really want.
Awesome. So I wanted to mention as well, so you do a little bit of angel investing now, right? So the shoe's a little bit on the other foot. Like, what do you look for in the investments that you make?
So I actually look at angel investing in the same way that I look at bringing on a potential partner or person onto my team, which is, do I believe they can take this business all the way? Do I believe that they're just a nice person that I want to work with? And so at Zola, we have kind of 8 different culture screeners that we kind of ask ourselves every time we interview someone. And the most important one is we have a no asshole policy, which, in America it's no asshole policy. Same thing. But that's the same thing when it comes to angel investing for me. And then the third thing is, what I look for is this startup able to address some of the pain points that I've seen in the various startups that I've worked with? And so do I understand it as a potential customer or a potential business partner? And so for that reason, I've focused my angel investing on 3 areas, all somewhat related to commerce. So one is direct-to-consumer commerce. The second is marketplaces or curated e-commerce stores, kind of in the same vein as Zola. And then the third is SaaS businesses that service startups or commerce companies. And the reason I focused on those is because I deeply understand the needs and pain points, and so I can understand, are these companies trying to solve them in unique, innovative ways.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think we're kind of out of time for questions, unfortunately. Everybody give Shan a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you can take off stage.